I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we report on the ballistic missiles that fell on Kyiv and other cities overnight, consider the divergent American and Ukrainian approaches to forthcoming talks, and hear from a range of experts on the pivotal issues of the moment.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 12th of February, 2 years and 348 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor for Defence, Dominic Nicholls. He's dialing in from the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, where he's joined by Senior Fellow for Land Warfare, Ben Barry, Senior Fellow for Chinese Security and Defence Policy, Meia, and Senior Fellow for Defence Economics, Fenella, McGerty. First, though, over to Dom for the latest from the battlefronts.
So there's been major bombardments across Ukraine in the last 24 hours. Kyiv, as well as many other major cities, hit. Russian attacks have killed at least 1, injured 16, comes from regional authorities. So last night, Russia launched 123 Shahed-type drones, as well as decoys, and 7 Iskander-M ballistic missiles or S-400 missiles. Difficult to identify these things. That comes from the Air Force. Now, the Air Force also said that 6 of the 7 missiles that targeted the cities of Kyiv and Kryvyi Rih down in the Donbass were intercepted by air defences. They also shot down 71 of the drones across 11 oblasts in the country. 40 decoy drones were either piled in or brought down by electronic warfare, but some did get through. Now, as we say, 1 person's been killed. There's a lot of damage still. There were also aerial bombs dropped on the residential areas of Zoloshiv. That's in Kharkiv region. Civilians reported to be trapped under the rubble there. 3 pulled out, but rescue efforts still ongoing. Multiple explosions also in Konstantinivka and Sloviansk. On the ground, however, very little movement, almost nothing down in the Donbass, but nothing else to report there on the ground. It's all been in the air over the last 24 hours. Now, reporting from the ISW say that the Kremlin might be trying to set the narrative for possible false flag attacks in the Baltic Sea and against Russian opposition politicians living abroad in order to discredit Ukraine. Now, remember, we've been speaking about that tanker in the port of Ust-Liga, about 100 km west of St. Petersburg, near the border with Estonia, that underwent that sort of very mysterious 3 underwater blasts in the last few days. Well, Russian SVR, that's the Foreign Intelligence Service, they said yesterday that Ukraine's GUR, the military intelligence department, they said that they had operated with assistance from unspecified Western countries with intent to blow up a foreign vessel in the Baltic Sea, which may well be the tanker that we've been speaking about. Now, the SVR say that this is in order to prompt NATO to block Russia's access to the sea, the Baltic Sea, with the overall aim of starting a direct conflict between Russia and NATO. That seems a little bit overblown, I might say. However, the SVR also claimed that unspecified European intelligence services and Ukraine's military intelligence directorate also plan to assassinate Russian opposition figures living abroad and blame Russia for those assassinations in order to undermine any future peace negotiations. Russia's SVR has form here. They've previously accused Ukraine and other Western states of planning false flag attacks, all as part of discrediting Ukraine and driving a wedge in sort of Western support for the country, especially moments of high political tension, as there is at the moment with these sort of suggestions of any future peace deal. The Munich Security Conference this weekend likely to see the US outline some form of plan, if not to us, the public, but then to allies. So this could all be the just false flag, and we will see what comes of that. One other one for me, Francis, Ukraine Security Service, so the SBU, they have detained the head of the agency's counter-terrorism department. So a very significant development here. This is the Kyiv Independent reporting this. They say the head of the SBU's counter-terrorism department is suspected of working for Russian intelligence. Now, the head of SBU, Vasyl Malyuk, he was speaking at a press conference this morning. They did not reveal the suspects' names. However, Kyiv Independent, speaking to their sources, say that the individual allegedly that's been held for this is Colonel Dmytro Kozura. Now, the SBU chief, when he was giving the conference this morning, he said, using encrypted software bookmarks, we penetrated the traitor's gadgets, mobile terminals and computers. We basically lived with him and conducted audio and video monitoring. Now that's the SBU, he's described the operation as part of an ongoing internal purge and warned that no Russian infiltration attempts would succeed. We are told we should expect more details of the case to be released soon. That's it for updates, Francis. I'm currently across London. I'm at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. They've launched today their 2025 military balance, the sort of global roundup of military capabilities and defence expenditure. So I've been speaking to some folk here. Be speaking to Ben very shortly, and also managed to get a couple of pre-records in with some of the other research fellows here. But that's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. We'll come back to you shortly. I'm going to start my geopolitical section with what may seem like a small story in the grand scheme, but is indicative of the Kremlin's wider strategy and underscores the potential traps being set for the new administration in Washington. So yesterday, after our broadcast, Donald Trump welcomed home American schoolteacher Mark Fogel after he was suddenly released from prison in Russia. He was charged in 2021 with carrying a small amount of medical marijuana, which had been prescribed in the US, and given a 14-year prison sentence. In other words, classic hostage diplomacy. Trump welcomed him back to the US in front of the media at the White House. Fogel said, and I quote, "President Putin was very generous and statesmanlike in granting me a pardon," which reads rather suspiciously like a press release. Do ordinary people really say statesmanlike? Anyway, which Trump nodded along to, adding that the terms of Fogel's release were very fair and that Putin had not got much in return. He said another detainee would be freed today without giving their name, then said the release was a show of good faith from the Russians and it could be a big, important part of ending the war. He said, "We were treated very nicely by Russia. Actually, I hope that's the beginning of a relationship where we can end that war and millions of people can stop being killed." So for many, this is a textbook case of why dictatorial regimes take hostages. It gives one a bargaining chip in negotiations and it allows one to appear magnanimous or even generous when they are released. Putin wants to appear like he's entering talks with the US in good faith and as a reasonable, rational partner, and is trying to win around the Trump camp. It was interesting to see Trump's former Vice President Mike Pence break cover yesterday to criticize Trump's remarks, which appeared to suggest that it was conceivable Ukraine would be Russian one day. He said, "If Ukraine falls, it will only be a matter of time until Russia invades a NATO ally. Our troops will be required to defend." Now, another danger, of course, is the conscious or unconscious erosion of certain long-standing fundamentals. Francis Fukuyama, of course, who famously wrote The End of History, has just penned an op-ed where he spells this out starkly. To quote him, he says, "Even if Trump's threats to Panama, Greenland and Gaza are hollow, they set an absolutely terrible precedent. One of the great achievements of the post-1945 world was acceptance of a general norm that great powers should not use military force to grab someone else's territory. This norm was massively violated by Putin's Russia in 2014 and 2022, and China has been contemplating the use of force to retake Taiwan. Trump has revived the 19th century idea of spheres of influence, that great powers should be able to control regions geographically close to them." He goes on, "There will be huge contradictions in Trump's foreign policy going forward. His nominee for Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, has a history of opposing American initiatives in Syria and Ukraine and will now have to support Trump's efforts to expand the territory of the United States. Some Republicans, like Senator Rand Paul, who are consistent isolationists, have begun to raise questions about the direction Trump is going. Paul explained, "I thought we voted for America first. We have no business contemplating yet another occupation to doom our treasure and spill our soldiers' blood." So Francis Fukuyama there. Now, I should say Tulsi Gabbard's Senate confirmation hearing is scheduled for later today, 4 o'clock London time and 11 o'clock Eastern. Also happening today is the latest meeting of the Ukraine Contact Group. That's Rammstein, of course, of the more than 50 countries supporting Ukraine. This one, the 26th, will be the first with the USA not invited to chair. That honour falls to the UK. We understand that accelerated weapons delivery is high on the agenda, but I imagine we'll know more later on. In an interview with The Guardian yesterday, President Zelensky reiterated that Europe will not be able to completely meet Ukraine's military needs and provide adequate security guarantees without US involvement. Something that, as we've said before, is really a massive deal historically. He also called for the West to provide Ukraine with additional Patriot air defence systems, obviously logical given the strikes that Dom was just talking about. Now, the Ukrainian position, as you'll know, is complex, and the best summary of it and how it's evolved over the course of the war that I've read so far this year is by Natalia Gumenyuk in a long read for Foreign Affairs called Putin's Ukraine, the End of War and the Price of Russian Occupation. She's one of the founders of the Reckoning Project, which researches war crimes in Ukraine and has appeared on the podcast twice before, I believe. But she summarises how, from the perspective of many in the West, given the fact Ukraine has managed to hold on to 80% of its territory, but is suffering high casualties and gradual territorial losses in the east, that securing a ceasefire and bringing relief to the bulk of the country would be a top priority. But she goes on, yet that is not how Ukrainians see it. Many Ukrainians themselves are deeply sceptical of a settlement, saying that no deal is better than a bad deal. In part, Ukrainians' continued support for the war can be explained by the country's resilience. Despite intense pressure on civilian areas, Ukraine has managed to preserve and even rebuild a degree of normalcy. Following the economic shock of the initial invasion, Western budgetary support, which now makes up 20% of the GDP, has allowed the economy to grow by an average of 4.4% over the past 2 years. There's been real household income growth, and inflation remains fairly low. Since the middle of 2023, when Ukrainian drones had effectively neutralised Russia's Black Sea fleet, maritime routes have been open again, with Ukrainian exports up by 15% over the past year. And according to the government in Kyiv, some 40% of the weapons Ukraine is now using on the front lines are produced domestically, compared with hardly any in 2022. None of these changes take away from the extraordinary hardships of war, but they have helped give Ukrainian society a kind of adaptability and endurance that may not be fully visible to outsiders. But, Natalia goes on, even more central to Ukrainian thinking about the war are the powerful and complex effects of the Russian occupation. For Ukrainians, occupation has been an ongoing reality for more than a decade, ever since Moscow seized Crimea and parts of the Donbass. The horror of Russian military rule has not been felt in areas of the south and the east only, but where most of the war has been fought, but also near Kyiv in the opening weeks of the invasion, when Russia's forces committed widespread atrocities in the capital's suburbs. Just as important, Ukrainians understand that the threat goes well beyond the occupied areas themselves. In addition to the 6 million who were caught in these areas, it has affected millions of displaced people who had to move farther west, and many more, including members of the Ukrainian cabinet who have relatives living under Russian domination. As many Ukrainians recognise, what observers in the West have characterised as brutal excesses in occupied areas are in fact a central part of Russia's war strategy. Moscow's used its control of significant numbers of Ukrainians to undermine the stability of the whole country, even without taking more territory. As Ukrainians know too well, the Kremlin, while pretending to negotiate, used the 8 years of so-called frozen conflict after 2014 to create a launch pad for the larger invasion. Put simply, Russian control over any part of Ukraine subverts and corrodes Ukrainian sovereignty everywhere. And Natalia in the piece then goes on to talk about how, from Putin's perspective, he doesn't see why the US should care who controls the villages, that in his view, Russia is bigger and stronger than Ukraine, and that settles the matter. And also talks in detail about the fact that it's not a simple picture when it comes to the occupied territories, that once they fall, they've fallen for good. She says, and I quote, that even in Crimea, almost any form of resistance was deemed impossible because of the pervasive presence of agents of the SSB. It seemed the local population had completely embraced annexation. Today, though, by contrast, activists regularly spread yellow ribbons, symbols of the Ukrainian resistance, in Yalta and Sevastopol. These remarkable acts of defiance show that the occupation is conditioned not only on the strength of Russia's security apparatus, but also on the extent to which people themselves believe that the current state of affairs is not permanent and that things might change. So for more on that, of course, do check in on Friday. Dr. Jane McGlynn will be back for her next update on resistance in the occupied territories. But just to conclude Natalia's piece in Foreign Affairs, this is the last paragraph. She says Ukraine might be able to consider a deal to end the war if, for example, it were offered membership in NATO, given more sophisticated weapons to defend itself in the future, join the EU, and receive from the West all the financing it needs for reconstruction. But until Washington and its European allies provide those kinds of guarantees, and until the West recognises that Russia's occupation is really aimed at the rest of Ukraine, Ukrainians are likely to stay committed to the war, however high the costs. And if a ceasefire is reached that does not address this continuing Russian threat, lasting peace and stability will remain elusive. So a fascinating read there. I know I've quoted from it extensively, but there's much, much more in it that I mean, it's just fantastic. So I highly recommend digesting it in full, linked in the show notes. But now back to our roving correspondent, Dom Nicholls. Dom, as you say, you're at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London this morning. Can you just tell us a little bit more about the event, who you've been badgering, and most importantly, was the breakfast offering porridge or something more stodgy?
Well, hello, Francis. It was a delightful smorgasbord of pastries, which obviously I didn't tuck into because a moment on the lips, a year on the hips, and all that. Anyway, I'm here with Ben Barry, retired Brigadier Ben Barry, Senior Fellow for Land Warfare here at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. So we've been over here today because today's the launch of the 2025 Military Balance. That's IISS's annual assessment of global military capabilities and defence economics. It is the go-to reference guide for many defence journalists about what's happening in the world and what's likely to happen. Now, Ben, dialing into welcome to Ukraine the latest, by the way, again.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
Haven't had you for a while. We were talking earlier on about what's the state of the war at the moment. You said there's been no change to Russia's aims. The strategy remains attrition on the battlefield, to try and outlast Western support and exploit the Trump presidency. You say that on the land, Russia has the initiative, maybe not momentum, but initiative. Now, if we could set aside the politics for a moment, where is the war in military terms?
Well, Russia has the initiative on land, and my judgment is that over the next year it will continue to be able to conduct these infantry-heavy, artillery-heavy attritional attacks, which gain it a kilometre or even less when they mount them. But they do cause heavy casualties on the Ukrainian defenders, which sooner or later are forced to grudgingly give ground. And if nothing changes, we're likely to see another year of bloody attrition and very slow Russian advance on land. But it's different at sea or in the air, because over the last 3 years at sea, Ukraine has waged a remarkable campaign, losing various sorts of missiles and robotic boats, and have successfully pushed the Russian Black Sea fleet back to the east of the Black Sea. And they've been able to open a maritime supply corridor up to Odessa, which has enabled them to send grain out and also import stuff in. And Ukraine is likely to continue to try and exploit that advantage over this year. They're also going to try and wrest the initiative away from Russia in the air. Well, since the outbreak of the war, Russia's been doing missile and drone attacks against military targets in strategic depth in Ukraine, command and control nodes, logistic infrastructure, and Ukrainian defense industry. They'll continue to keep trying to do that, and they can continue to produce missiles and attack drones to do so. But Ukraine is increasingly using its missiles and attack drones to attack similar targets in Russia. And what we've seen over the last year is a gradual increase in these Ukrainian attacks, an increase of the range at which they're conducted, up to 1,000 kilometers, for example. And Ukraine is hoping that they can not only help shape the battle of the narrative that way and bring the cost of the war home to the Russian people and political elite, but also they're hoping that they can degrade Russia's deep attack capability, where the glide bombs are, where the missile firing aircraft are, where the drones are launched from. And I've seen considerable evidence that Ukraine has great ambitions to do more And they may also be receiving many more Western drones and have an uptick in their own drones to allow them to wage their deep attack. But whether they'll wrest the initiative from Russia in the air, I don't know.
Now, throughout January, we saw there were 16 Ukrainian long-range attacks on Russian oil infrastructure in particular, but energy infrastructure more broadly. They looked very quite striking on social media, good for domestic morale, as you say. But actually, have they had any military effect, those long-range strikes?
Well, there are two effects I think we've seen. One is at the end of last year, they did a very successful attack on a huge ammunition depot where they blew up, most of the ammunition bunkers in that depot. And that was said by Western defense officials and Ukrainian defense officials to very quickly have an effect on artillery supply, to the extent that ammunition available to Russian guns was reduced by 50%. And there was definitely military benefit to Ukraine from that.
Now, you mentioned the supply of munitions, Western supply, and the domestically produced supply inside Ukraine. How strong is Ukraine's domestic defence industry at the moment? How far along are they to be either self-sufficient or to be able to have, in capability areas such as long-range strike, a capability to speak of, so they don't need to worry about any potential policy restrictions from outside?
Well, that their drone industry and their missiles, in terms of longer range cruise missiles, has grown considerably, and they're using as many of them as they can. And they're not faced by peacetime constraints, for example, in testing them or on risk. So they're going all out on that. Ukraine, of course, had a defense industrial facilities that it inherited from the breakup of the Soviet Union. Russia knew where many of them were, and of course they were attacked by cruise missiles. Ukraine's not saying what the state of its defense industry is for obvious reasons. But what we do know, and we comment on this in the Military Balance book, is that several Western military companies have partnered with Ukraine in terms of setting up manufacturing and also repair and maintenance facilities in Rheinmetall. And we're likely to see more of that.
Now, a lot of talk at the moment about peace talks. I mean, not talk between the governments of Russia and Ukraine, but a lot of chat in the blogosphere, if you like, in the Twitterati. Are we using the correct language? You talk about peacekeeping, but peacekeeping principles are consent of the parties, impartiality, no use of force except in self-defense. President Zelensky has talked about deterrence forces. What do you think a deterrence force would look like, the size and scope? And what risks are there to the West of supplying troops for a deterrent force? The opportunities there for Russia to create mischief?
Well, I'm glad you make the distinction between the two terms. Zelensky has said that a deterrent force would need between 100,000 and 150,000 troops. I think he's right. I think on the ground there would need to be at least a corps, a very combat-capable corps, able to move fast across Ukraine, equipped with a lot of firepower, attack helicopters, and its own intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. There would also need to be a maritime contingent in the Black Sea to achieve deterrent effects in the Black Sea, and both would need to be supported by an air component as well, which would also need to be heavy in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Now, in theory, Europe has enough forces to provide that, although we see evidence that many NATO countries' armed forces are at an inadequate standard of readiness, include, for example, the Dutch and the British armed forces. But the real difficulty, potentially, for a NATO European nation that thought of participating to this, is the US involvement, because there's a lot of informed speculation that Secretary Hesketh will be saying that this should not be a NATO force and it would not be covered by Article 5. Well, that, I think, will be seen by Russia as an opportunity, an opportunity to create mischief, to wage hybrid or grey zone attacks, or to bide their time and then start nibbling away at Ukraine after a few years have elapsed. So if I was a defence minister or a prime minister of a European nation that was being invited to contribute, I'd be very worried about doing so if the US were not looped into this in more of a way than Hesketh seems to admit of.
There is the temptation would almost be too great, I imagine, if there was no overt US support, even if they didn't have boots on the ground, but in provision of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance aircraft, as we saw last week,
Yes.
the RC-135 rivet joint over the Black Sea.
Mm.
So if there's no obvious US support or even a political statement about Article 5, yeah, I agree. I think it'd be almost too tempting for Russia to not to meddle in the grey zone or whatever we want to call it. I mean, is it dangerous that we're even at the stage now of sort of looking to the US for a specific comment on Article 5 or not? Yes, no, because that useful ambiguity was kind of quite useful.
Yeah.
And actually now asking the US to come out and declare one way or the other if this document would have a dangerous position to be in, is it not?
I agree with you, Dominic. I mean, we should remember that Article 5 is not geographically constrained. So the only time NATO's invoked it was for an attack on the mainland United States by Al-Qaeda. You have to remember the great difficulties that 30 years ago were posed by the war in Bosnia, where many European contingents on the ground in Bosnia were disconnected from the US, and the US made some contribution in terms of air power above, but it was politically disconnected from the war in Bosnia as well. And it was only in 1995, when the US became militarily, politically and diplomatically engaged in the war in Bosnia, that the conflict was resolved. People like me, who actually served on the ground in Bosnia during that very difficult phase, know just how much difficulty was caused by that lack of US engagement. We're in great danger of that scenario repeating itself.
Now, looking a bit more broadly, if I may, a couple more for me. Russia's military expenditure has increased by 41.9%, we're told today, in the military balance, to take its budget to 6.7% of GDP. That's higher than the total defence spending in the rest of Europe in purchasing power parity terms. Now, that does sound scary, but can they spend it? I.e., who would they buy the stuff from? Do they have the rest of the systems in place in order to turn that lump of money into a military capability?
Well, they seem to be spending it pretty well now. Several years ago, they put their defence industry on a proper war footing, 24/7 operations, 7 days a week, increased the salaries, to the extent that the defence industry is sucking people out of the technical areas of the domestic economy. They also greatly ramped up salaries for people who volunteer to serve with the military, which in terms of Russian average income means that they become very wealthy men. And also the death benefits for the families are quite considerable. Now, some of that is actually being borne not by the Russian MOD, but by local authorities and indeed by companies that also provide people and contingents. Now, Russia has problems of inflation, of all sorts of negative financial consequences of this. But my judgment is that if Putin has the political will, he can continue like this for at least another year. Now, there does seem to have been a sort of deal between Putin and the Russian people, which is that they're not going to do another compulsory mobilization, but they're going to use money to induce people into the Russian armed forces. And indeed, these are people who come from the regions, particularly the impoverished regions, such as the Caucasus, rather than the urban elites of Moscow and St. Petersburg. But I think that Putin can sustain this level of physical and personnel mobilization for the next year.
Now, last question. We also heard this morning that the UK, the opinion was offered that the UK would not be able to defend itself today against a ballistic missile attack. It's only 80 years since we were last under ballistic missile attack. We seem to do okay. Then when did we take the eye off the ball? Or firstly, do you agree with that we could not defend ourselves today? And if so, when did we take our eye off the ball?
Okay, there's a very limited ballistic missile defence capability on the Type 45 destroyers, of which there's only a few, and their reliability and availability is poor. But they're there to help protect the fleet and forces ashore from ballistic missile. So the UK has very little in the way of ballistic missile defence. Now, it could choose to reverse this. This was a decision actually taken in the last Strategic Defence and Security Review that George Robertson ran in 1998, not to invest further in integrated air and missile defence for the UK mainland. It's something that also was replicated across NATO. Now, the UK could choose to reverse that, but these don't come cheap. They're very, very expensive capabilities to shoot down conventionally armed ballistic missiles. We shouldn't also forget that there's another threat, which is cruise missiles and long-range drones. Now, though any of those heading for the UK could be shot down by RAF Typhoons carrying air-to-air missiles, as indeed they shot down a few Iranian drones heading towards Israel. But my judgment is that in common with the other shortages of ammunition and spare parts and supplies, the RAF's fleet of Typhoons and air-to-air missiles is probably insufficient to stop a heavy wave of long-range drones and cruise missiles. In addition, the UK's airborne early warning capability is minimal with 3 Wedgetails, and that would cause problems as well. But I think the SDR's got a very hard choice to make about this. The other thing is there's absolutely no sense in spending money on ballistic missile defence if at the same time you don't spend money on civil defence. And if you choose, and it's a perfectly respectable choice for a government to make, not to have missile defence and not to improve air defence against cruise missiles and drones, civil defence becomes even more important.
Ben, thank you so much. Plenty more we could talk about, but I'm getting eyes from your people. I'll let you go. What should I keep my eye on in Munich this weekend, just before you're heading out?
Well, I think Vance's statements and any that are made by Hesketh and what Zelensky says about Ukraine, but also I think you should look very closely at the body language of European defence ministers, including the UK defence ministers, about the implications of the US doing less to support Ukraine and potentially doing less to NATO.
Ben Barry, thank you so much for joining us today. I've never said this before, but Francis, back to the studio.
And I think that'll be the last time you ever say it as well, Dom. And now for the further interviews Dom recorded at the Institute this morning. Meia Nouwens is an expert in Chinese defence analysis, the country's defence industry and regional strategic affairs. She leads research on China's digital Silk Road at the Institute. Before joining, she worked as a policy officer in Taipei for the European External Action Service. This is her conversation with Dom.
I'm joined by Meia Nouwens, Senior Fellow for Chinese Security and Defence Policy here at IISS. Really interested in the areas of China today, Meia. You say China's armed forces are continuing to modernise under 3 specific themes: anti-corruption, reorganisation and reform. How big a problem is corruption in the PLA? And welcome to Ukraine the latest.
I think corruption is a consistent problem in the PLA. We know that there have been large-scale anti-corruption investigations before, early on in Xi Jinping's first term as president. I would argue that this is a mainstay of how the PLA operates and how Chinese defense industry operates. It's not a bug, it's a feature. As such, there will be, I think, continuous corruption investigations, but we have to keep in mind, of course, what these anti-corruption investigations are geared towards. They are a reflection of 2 things. One, corruption happens when there's large-scale procurement and opportunity for corruption or money changing hands more easily. Certainly when there's large sums involved, there seems to be an opportunity for this to be persistent. And then, of course, there's kind of smaller scale, lower level corruption across the services as well, which we have noted in Chinese sources. But there is also another element of China's anti-corruption investigations that serve political purposes. And these political purposes can be geared towards removing people in certain positions of power across the PLA who might have disagreements about the direction of modernization, who might be regarded as disloyal politically to President Xi Jinping, who is the chairman of the Central Military Commission as well. And so I think we have to be mindful of the fact that both of these two elements of anti-corruption investigation seem to be present, I don't think that they would have a long-term impact on the direction of PLA modernization or on the progress of PLA modernization. Certainly not the likelihood that the PRC is going to be able to achieve the goal set out for PLA modernization, but certainly in the short term, they will be disruptive.
And I want to talk corruption on the kind of the scale of Russia, so huge amounts of money being siphoned off, which dents military capability. I'll ask you specifically about some of the programs in a minute, but it doesn't look as if Chinese production of very modern military capability is really being that dented. So what kind of scale, aside from the political areas, what scale of actual sort of monetary graft and stealing cash, what kind of scale are we looking at here with China?
It's hard to tell because none of that has been discussed in Chinese reporting or literature, funnily enough. So it's difficult to understand, and we are therefore reliant on two things to try to understand the scope and scale of this actual corruption and graft. The first, of course, is do we see an impact in what the PLA is able to produce, both in terms of modernity and in total numbers? Has the rate of production changed? And there we don't really see a slowing down across the different types of production lines. Perhaps the second element that we rely on is any kind of open source reporting from other sources, be that usually the United States, that is able to give an insight into where specific corruption cases have taken place and what the impact on capability was. One case in point was, for example, the corruption investigation through the rocket force. And the example given is that there were missiles that were filled with water instead of actual rocket fuel. So in that sense, that gives us an insight, but we aren't necessarily able to say whether or not that was the case across the Strategic Support Force or the PLA Navy, or indeed to what extent and exactly where corruption took place in something like the Central Military Commission's Equipment Development Department, which leads on procurement and contracting.
I mean, that sounds really odd. I can see why somebody might want to steal all the money for the rocket fuel, but to go to the extent of filling the missiles with water, I mean, who's going to go around and lift these things up to see if they weigh what they should do? That seems a bit bizarre. Anyway, the other areas of modernization, you say, were reorganization and reform. Now, what does that look like in terms of procurement and build?
Well, the reorganization that we saw take place was mainly in the PLA's former Strategic Support Force being disbanded. It only came into existence a few years ago, so it was a relatively new organization, and instead being disbanded and reformed into three smaller support arms, and that has to do with information support, the cyberspace domain, and PLA capability in the aerospace domain. So think of outer space capabilities. However, that reform doesn't necessarily have an impact directly on PLA capability development just yet. What I think that reform was a reflection of was perhaps, one, an understanding that the PLA's goal of becoming a networked, data-centric military whereby all service branches and theater commands are able to seamlessly collect, share, analyze data was not yet making the progress that had been hoped at the pace that had been hoped. And we've heard a few years ago President Xi Jinping say that the goal of informationization, as they call it, Xinxihua, was woefully behind track. So perhaps it's a reflection that actually there was not enough oversight of what is now the Information Support Force. And so Xi Jinping needed a much clearer view of what was happening there. And second of all, there is I think a consensus that this lack of oversight might also have led to perhaps overreach or decision-making in terms of activity that was not in line with Chinese political goals. And here I'm speaking specifically about the balloon incident over the United States, whereby the U.S. shot down a Chinese reported, suspected, I suppose now confirmed, surveillance balloon. That, I think, is created a political situation, a political problem between the U.S. and China. And so having greater oversight over these support organizations, these support arms, is politically important for Xi Jinping as well.
Thank you. Now, in terms of spending, an uplift of spending by 7% sees China's budget, defense budget, of around $235 billion equivalent. That makes up 44% of total spending in Asia. When did we last see such figures coming out of that part of the world?
From China, the percentage of GDP directed towards defense spending has been relatively consistent. Of course, in terms of year-on-year growth, in the total budget, we have seen a gradual decrease over the last 10 years. We no longer see the year-on-year growth of around 10 or more percent for China's defense budget from the central government's reports. Nevertheless, this is, of course, significant if you are a smaller or medium power in the region bordering China, certainly. From Taiwan's perspective, for example, the year-on-year change in real terms in the Chinese defense budget could equate, and it has done, your entire national defense budget. So these are not insignificant numbers.
Now, you mentioned Taiwan there. Just to finish off there, we're seeing a continued rollout of Chinese J-20 multi-role aircraft, the super stealth jet. Is that fair for journalistic shorthand?
I think we call it the low observable aircraft.
Low observable super stealth jet, potato. Anyway, also third aircraft carrier, the Fujian, she's commenced sea trials. Fourth is under construction. They've got 2 new long-range fire support brigades. What defence policy objectives do you assess underpins a military of that size and ambition?
I think this is a military that, one, judges its international environment to be increasingly unstable. There's also a clear political goal here that's driving PLA modernization, that is reunification with Taiwan, and the recognition, as has been the case over the last few decades, that a military capability might be necessary to either underpin deterrence, but also to achieve this goal of cross-strait unification or reunification from the CCP's perspective. I think it's very clear that the PLA has considered its previous level of military capability as woefully unprepared and not suited to the task of modern warfighting, that they had been left behind in modernization terms. And so all of this seeks to not just catch up, but of course outpace what the Chinese see as an adversary in their backyard.
And just finally, do you think, in terms of that very clear threat to Taiwan, do you think the US see it as clear-eyed as you do?
I think there have been a number of statements from US leadership that they see this as a clear-eyed threat. What they rightly note is that capability does not equate political will on the Chinese side. And that's certainly the case when we think about goals such as the 2027 goal of PLA army rebuilding and professionalization. We understand that there is a capability goal towards that date to be combat ready for any Taiwan scenario. But that, of course, is not a political deadline that signals will for a Taiwan invasion in 2 years' time.
But is that all that's happening in terms of threat being capability, intent, and the opportunity given to you by the other side's weakness? Are you saying that they have the capability or are likely to by 2027? And the opportunities, as it is, how prepared Taiwan/US and others may or may not be. And it's just that political intent that's yet to fall into place. So that's the missing piece. And if that changes, it could be very serious in a couple of years' time.
I agree. Political will on the Chinese side is also the most difficult one to predict, of course. What Xi Jinping thinks on a daily basis is not known, but certainly there is a will towards achieving reunification along a timeline that has been laid out towards mid-century. But we do know that this is something that Xi Jinping treats as both a personal as well as a professional goal for his legacy. So when that political will and that opportunity align is what we need to be most cautious of.
Meia, thank you so much for chatting to Ukraine the latest.
Thank you.
Fenella McGerty is a senior fellow for defence economics at the Institute. She leads their research on defence economics and oversees data featured in the Military Balance and other key publications. This is her conversation with Dom.
So I'm delighted to be joined by Fenella McGerty, Senior Fellow for Defence Economics here at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. So, Fenella, your area of expertise is the spending of looking at the spending and economic side of global military capabilities. In the Military Balance launched today, you say global military spending's gone up by 7.4% in 2024, rising to, well, in US terms, US dollars, $2.46 trillion. When did the world last see such figures?
Thank you. Thanks. And thanks for having me. I think if we're looking at the overarching trend in terms of global spending, the growth last year was significant. And if you look at it on a regional basis in Europe, the level of growth that we saw, 11.7% in real terms, that has not been seen for decades. There was a similar spike in the 50s, but then otherwise we're talking about the growth during World War II. That said, the level of spending, yes, it is high, but as a proportion of GDP, global spending is much lower if you compare it to levels seen during World War II and during the Cold War. So for the level of spending is a lot higher as a proportion of countries' economy, or in that metric, it is lower when you compare it to when countries were actually at war, when you got close to 30 to 50% of GDP on defence.
I suppose what I'm trying to get at is the world becoming a more dangerous place. So what bang do you get for your buck now? With the spending today, are you getting more military capability than you would have done for comparative figures back in the 50s and Second World War, as you say? Are we moving towards a more militarised world, basically?
I think the growth in 2024 was really a culmination. It's been the result of really quite strong growth in certain regions over the last 10 years since the strategic situation and global threat perceptions have intensified. So again, if we focus on Europe, there was that pivotal shift in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, and then the full invasion in 2022 of Ukraine. And those created such pivotal points where European spending had been atrophying, if you will, before that, in the peace dividend and then the fiscal constraints caused by the global financial crisis. We saw defence spending really take a hit. And as a consequence, because you had that underinvestment for the kind of decades leading into this period, it's now becoming increasingly important for these countries to recapitalise, to cover those capabilities that were lost over that period of underinvestment. So what we're seeing is that reorientation of defence spending, where a lot of the funding and a lot of the increases are towards capital spending, so purchases, acquisitions, procurement spending. That said, that is going to squeeze other areas of the budget. So we are seeing issues start to feed through where it was this kind of scramble to get to that 2% of GDP, increase investment, recapitalise, and then other areas of spending didn't have as much investment, so personnel, operations and maintenance, and that really started to impact resilience. So there's still pressures to continue to increase defence spending despite record levels of growth in quite a few regions.
Now, if we could zoom in on Russian defence spending for a moment, you say the Russian defence budget is now 120 billion US dollars equivalent. That's gone up significantly. I couldn't remember the figure. You said doubled. I couldn't quite remember since when it had doubled. But you also say it's very, very difficult to get a good idea of Russia's economic situation. The decline in Russian transparency regarding to defence economics means it's very, very difficult to get a clear figure. How much confidence level do you have in the figures you put out for Russia? And when you say Russia is outpacing the rest of Europe spending on defence, and equally China is outpacing the rest of Asia on defence, how durable are those financial positions?
The rate of growth in Russian spending is remarkable in 2024, and it comes off a 2-year period of really strong growth as well. So we had 18% real terms growth in 2022, again in 2023, 18%, and then nearly 42% in 2024. And yes, that is outpacing European unprecedented levels of growth. But what's difficult within Russia is determining an accurate measure of defence spending. So we have the national budget, defence budget chapter, which gives funding for sort of the core MOD, some personnel spending. That's the official defence budget. But then if you consider other aspects of spending where you're looking at funding that comes from other areas of the budget, it gets quite methodological, quite technical, because we're actually starting to have to do this in Europe increasingly, because that definition of defence has widened because of that race to bolster the top line in defence spending. It's not necessarily the core defence budget that is getting those uplifts. It's additional items of spending. It's supplementary, it's special funds, or it's allocations from other areas for R&D investment, for instance. And Russia isn't unique here. We've always tracked a core defence budget and the total military expenditure figure. So total military expenditure is considerably higher and has reached those growth levels as well. When you consider that costs in Russia are relatively lower than for Europe, say, it's therefore important to look at what the Russia budget can actually afford. So if you look at it in purchasing power parity terms, the Russian budget in 2024 almost reached parity with total European spending, around the 460 billion mark. So when you consider that, it makes a lot more sense that Russia is able to continue funding these operations. Added to that, you also have wider defence spending in Russia that is being borne outside of even the wider definition of defence budget. It's being funded by regional governments, by families, by industry itself. So the wider costs of the war can go well beyond the 6-7% that we're looking at for total military expenditure, which is about 39% of federal government expenditure already. So if you consider the fact that it's already a huge economic burden, there are also these wider costs that are really starting to bite.
And these are, I made some notes, these are the sign-up inducements to get people to join up. They're outside the core Russian defence budget. Payments to families for dead soldiers as well, I think, is outside. So you say they've actually got a low fiscal deficit, lower now than during COVID and other financial crises. As you say, that it's difficult to get a firm handle on the actual defence figures. And if you look wider, this pressure, mainly from the US, mainly from Donald Trump to increase defence spending, seems to have pushed people more into the murky accounting areas. I noticed one of the other figures you say today is that Germany is now the biggest defence spender in Europe. But, for example, Germany counts its expenditure on Ukraine as part of its defence budget, whereas others do not. Just on that, is that quite widespread practice to use not only spending on Ukraine, but to start dragging in all these other areas that might not traditionally have been in the defence budget? Are they increasingly coming in to firm up the bottom line?
It's been a trend that we've been seeing certainly in Europe for over the last 10 years. The UK also implemented this kind of, when you look at the broader NATO definition of defence, on a country level, that might be funded by a different agency. So it wouldn't be the MOD that's funding it. It would be Ministry of Interior or the Homeland Security even. And as countries are making those shifts, it does unfortunately start to impact transparency and arguably accountability, because it can be difficult to track those extra elements of spending that are added to the core defence budget. So with Germany, the addition of the special fund for defence, the annual allocations, as well as military funding for Ukraine, has, as we've seen, pushed the German budget ahead of the UK. So now it's the second largest in NATO, largest in Europe. And that practice, I think, is becoming more and more widespread. The UK has always, for several years now, included Ukraine military aid in its defence budget calculation. So looking at the base budgets, you would have far lower allocations, certainly as a proportion of GDP. So it's important to be able to find where that funding is coming from, how it's being spent, because otherwise all this talk of growth, if it's not on actual effective core spending on capabilities, on personnel, then you risk the messaging getting lost and the effectiveness of spending getting lost. Yeah.
And just finally, if I may, what will the re-election of Donald Trump mean for the US defence budget, do you think?
The re-election of Donald Trump and the impact on the US defence budget is currently still ambiguous, because for all we have fairly bullish sentiments internationally, and obviously the pressure for NATO members to reach 5% of GDP, which the US wouldn't even reach themselves. Their spending as a proportion of GDP has actually been fairly stagnant over the last decade, and if not fallen to around 3.3% today. And that pressure is then countered by Donald Trump's moves to potentially withdraw from overseas or international commitments or any military aid, as well as the fiscal approach or fiscal efficiencies that they're driving towards in the US. And obviously the Pentagon budget has been the primary focus this week to finding those efficiency savings. So what we might have is a slight rebalancing within the US defence budget, and the top line might go down, but a lot more funding would, in theory, be allocated towards more domestic spending, core DoD funding. So where we're having those extra elements of spending, the supplemental budgets in the UK, in the US, if that starts to go down, that will start to impact the top line. But underneath that, I think the sentiment to continue funding defence, to bolster US defence industry, is still there. So it can't actually go down that much, because you don't want to be seen as weak on defence. But all those readjustments and the fiscal savings will start to have an impact to the top line as well.
Well, it all sounds very opaque. I'm glad you're crunching the numbers, not me. Thank you so much for chatting to us today. So that's the new military balance 2025. I guess you have time for a cup of tea now, and then you start on 2026.
Absolutely, yeah. On to the next.
Right.
Yeah, never stops.
Well, Fenella, thank you so much for chatting to us today.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X, formerly known as Twitter, so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really does help others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every single message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by executive producers Louisa Wells and David Knowles.